Hi, I'm Izzy Gentry, and thank you for jumping into Made to Walk. Today, we are going to talk about atypical children in church. And you might be wondering, what is the category of atypical children? And that might be a child who has OCD, ADD, autism, or some other kind of behavioral or cognitive disability or emotional disability. And when we're talking about these, um, niche demographics within our church. There's a lot of data out there that I don't think a lot of churches are very well connected with when we're talking about a very important part of the church as a whole. We don't know much about their experiences when it comes to church. So I want to share with you some of those statistics. An atypical child is more than twice as likely to never step foot into a church as a neurotypical child. In one study, more than half of special needs parents reported that their child with a disability has been excluded from church. Almost one third, 32.3%, of special needs families said they had left at least one church because their child was not included or welcomed. And nearly 50% of special needs parents said they refrained from participating in religious activities because their child was not included or welcome. So, when we're looking at these statistics, first of all, it's just so heartbreaking to know how many families are just not connecting with the church community because they feel like it's either too burdensome on themselves or too burdensome on the church to try to find a way to make it work. And so it's just easier to disengage. More than half of special needs parents reported that they had kept their child from participating in religious activity because support was not provided, or had been expected to stay with their child at a religious activity so their child could participate. So the barriers and the restrictions and the communication just look different when dealing with an atypical child. So you may be thinking, oh, it totally reminds me of so and so in our group or so and so in our church. It's going to bring someone to mind, and you may be thinking, we don't necessarily know how to bridge this gap of communication. How can we create resource and opportunity to share Jesus with this particular demographic of kids while also being able to maneuver the way our ministry is built to? And some of those restrictions are what we consider to be typical church, like high energy worship, lights and sound, um, textures and vibrant images, plays and activities, and free play. Those can be very difficult for an atypical child. So, I'm going to break down for you some ways that we have seen to be very beneficial with churches and nonprofits with being able to communicate both successful organization within the church and also communication with the families to show that they are capable or are willing to engage in a conversation to make things accessible, while also not creating these unrealistic expectations on one volunteer or another, because that's another thing, right? We're bringing in volunteers to work with these kids most of the time, and so to burden them with something that feels like a liability at times, especially when you have a sensory child that maybe does things like throws their head back or bites or screams, that can feel like the person that is handling this particular small little one isn't equipped with the skill set to do so, and so it can feel unsafe. So where do we go with the narrative without making someone feel discluded? And I'm going to break down just some really helpful key resources, and then also how to integrate some new forms and questions into your onboarding process in your children's ministry. So the first thing I want to break down is 4 simple step strategy. And the number one thing is visual schedule. It can be very simple if you are already preparing your children's ministry classes for a successful Sunday or Wednesday night or so on and so forth. You know what they're going to do. Maybe 15 minutes of music, 15 minutes of arts and crafts, 15 minutes of study, and then free play. Or maybe snack is in there and that's 5 minutes or whatever it may be. You have a pretty good idea of what that is, and you have probably even created a visual aid for the volunteer of that classroom. The difference is that posting that visual aid with just some simple pictures that you can pick from Canva or some other resource out there to have on the wall that shows an autistic child or a limited child what to expect next can really reduce the anxiety, the questions, the concerns, because they know, okay, we're going to do this and then we're going to do that. The second part of that is to create prompts. Prompts are very important and they need to be taught to your volunteers and your staff members before being able to be expected in the classroom. They're very simple instructions that most teachers already use. Hey guys, we're going to color for 5 more minutes and then we're going to pick up our crowns and we're going to move on to the next thing. In 2 more minutes, we're going to pick up our crowns and move on to the next thing. We've got 30 seconds and then we're going to pick up our crowns and move on to the next thing. Using those prompts really help to deflate, not always remove completely, but they can definitely help to de-escalate some of the transitional issues when dealing with some behavioral issues. And then number 3, plan. Provide parents with what we call a meltdown plan. Depending on what level the child is at, as far as being able to fully socially engage, the parent has a pretty good idea of what could happen. And so to be able to ask questions that aren't accusatory or feel as though you're isolating the kid, but just also being open to hearing what the parent has to say, like, hey, my kid may do this. If he doesn't have any prompts and he feels frustrated moving from one thing to another too quickly, he has a tendency to break pencils. Knowing that, okay, well, if a pencil's broken, what are we going to do? Or, is that something to call mom and dad about? Probably not. But if it's something like, oh, he tends to hit his head on the wall. Okay, well, what is our reporting and with these kinds of situations? Only if it inquires injury, only if it inquires injury to another child. Like where do you draw the lines? And just being able to identify what is our plan with dealing with a meltdown plan. And 4 is to create those brain breaks. Make sure that even though you may be thinking, well, they're getting older now and they have to be able to sit through a 30, 45-minute Bible study, not all cognitive engagement looks the same. And so create those breaks in between that allow people to stand up, move around, have access to resources to help them to just be able to stay focused, maybe adding some sensory tools into your classrooms for those that maybe have never had to sit through a 35-minute sermon and so on and so forth. So those are the 4 simple step strategies that you can implement. It can be a discouraging place to try to find a way to make church make sense. Loud noises, lots of moving people, flashing lights, rotations of volunteers, and kid-to-kid interaction can all seem daunting. Where there is a will, there is a way. Let leadership know if you are there. Ask and ask again. If discouraged, keep trying new church homes. This is what we tell families, to try to keep them engaged and to trying to find the perfect home. We get that not every church has the resources and the opportunity to be able to fully make things accessible for all families. However, we really do believe that there is a church out there for every family. So if you can't be the person that creates the resources, maybe help them get connected with another church that does. Don't just say, sorry, we don't do that here. We can't do that for you. If we made exceptions for you, we'd have to make exceptions for everyone. Being that closed door may be the closed door that officially keeps that family from ever coming back into church again. So if you can't be the solution, help them find the solution. Let's talk about onboarding. Onboarding someone into your children's ministry or maybe into an activity day that you might have, getting all of the information up front can really help to de-escalate a situation from happening or in the midst of something happening. And it's really important that we learn to communicate upfront and be proactive than to be reactive when something happens with a child and us go, I had no idea this was a thing. I didn't know what to do. We didn't know that anything was provided. So it just causes so much confusion. Asking more questions up front really helps, one, the parent actually feel like you're engaged, you're asking the right questions, you're trying to get as much information as possible. Clearly communicate that you may not always get it right, but you're trying to be informed, that you're trying to educate yourself. And thirdly, that you give yourself an opportunity for success, because you can't be successful if you don't know what the challenge is. So, the first thing you should know about dealing with atypical kids is that sometimes what you're dealing with isn't what you're dealing with. You may think that you're seeing one thing and really it's another. We always say if you've seen one autistic child, you've seen one autistic child. So sensory issues in one autistic child may not be the same in another. You may have one that is very affected by lights and sound and one that's not affected by lights and sound at all, but has a very difficult time transitioning from one activity to another. And then you may just have some focus issues, and you may think that it's autism, but then you go, oh, that child's just ADD or ADHD. And so we need to help them to give them some tools to stay focused. So some of the key things is that identifying what you know about the child is actually what you know about the child, that you're asking the questions and you're not trying to guess. So sometimes kids, when they're really, really little, let's just say you have them when they're 3 years old or less, they can tend to get caught up in this playful atmosphere, this emotional attachment to play. And so you may find that like the child doesn't respond to their name, but they respond to Batman, you know? And so if that's a thing, ask mom and dad, like, hey, we noticed that they're always wearing a Batman costume when they come in here. Does that help in transitions? Yeah, if you call them Batman, that, you know, like he'll move from one thing to another faster or whatever. Maybe helping you to de-escalate some of that behavior, believe it or not. Ask what the child's strengths are. Don't immediately jump into what's wrong with your kid. Immediately start with what are their strengths? What do they love? What are they interested in? What are things that they are excited about by coming to children's ministry or church? And so we can really help them to emphasize what those things are. And then ask what their emotional in intelligence age is and their intellectual intelligence age. These things can be very different. You may find that you have, and this can be with many different atypical kids, that you find that emotionally they're very, very young. They're very immature. But when it comes to intellectual knowledge, they're very, very smart, or vice versa. You may find that someone is just very emotionally mature, and then when it comes to intellectual, they're just not able to retain the information and the knowledge. So that can kind of help you to gauge the child fully. Sensory restrictions. This can be sights. This could be sounds, smells, textures. Just anything that can really catch them off guard. And that can help you to understand, okay, maybe during, it's not necessarily that you have to change your program, but maybe during this part of the program, a volunteer can take this child for a walk for 5 to 10 minutes and then bring them back in the room when they feel like it is going to be easier for them to be able to stay focused. Transition buddies are very, very helpful if you have one of your kiddos who is having a difficult time being able to transition from one thing to another. Having a stuffed animal, a stress buddy, a poppet, things that they find to be helpful for them to be able to hold, to squeeze, whatever their sensory attachment is. It may work for some, it may not work for others. Behavior tics. Some children can rock back and forth, make sounds, are unable to make eye contact. Knowing these things can really help you to gauge conversations, especially amongst young children. Young children who haven't been around atypical children all that much, they might ask questions like, why don't you ever look at me when I talk to you? Or why don't you do this? Or why don't you do that? Or why do you always have to sit in a chair? And so it can help you to frame the conversation so that you don't want the child asking the question to also feel like it was a dumb question because they're just ignorant to the situation. But you can understand how to frame it in a positive way so that they can get used to the atmosphere of both an atypical child being in a room of non-atypical children and also having a typical child to be able to learn how to communicate with an atypical child. Food restrictions, I always say keep a backup of something. But if a child needs some kind of dietary confinement, work with the parents and just say, if they're going to be there long term, if they look like they're going to be a long term member there at the church, what kind of resources or snacks can we have for them? Most of the time, I'll be honest with you, when you have parents of an atypical child, they're so used to having to create alternatives for their kid that they probably already are like, I've brought him his own snack, or I've brought her her own toy because she can or he can't do those things. Um, so just communicate with the parents. Transitional restrictions. And I realize that I'm going like in a really weird order from how I actually wrote it. So don't worry about it. It's just essentially, it's all the same questions. This is just things that you can put on your questionnaire on your onboarding. Transitional restrictions, we kind of talked about a little bit. Preferred intervention, we talked about a little bit as well. How would you like me to address some of the issues? I want to just hyper focus on number 11, ABA contact, because it's going to be your absolute lifeline. If the child is working with a therapist, an ABA, a speech therapist, an OT therapist, just anyone that is working with that child day in and day out, who understands, hey, these are his or her strengths and weaknesses, and these are his or her, triggers, it can really help you to understand the child more in depth. And I have many times integrated our own people into an environment with our child so that she can watch him in a different environment than what she's accustomed to see how he responds, so it can help ABA work with him at home about how to actually integrate in that atmosphere. But also, secondly, is that she's there as a resource for the church to say, hey, you know, this is something that works, this is something that doesn't. It might be helpful for you. And they do this with schools and other organizations. So why wouldn't they do it for churches? Stay Jesus centered. Ask the parents what they might hope to gain from church services. I think it's really important to have a goal focus. When you're dealing with an atypical child, it could feel like the walls are closing in at any given day. It can feel very chaotic. So if you set yourself with one goal, like what's one thing that we hope to have from this child? Maybe it's that they are able to participate in a song. Maybe it's that they're able to meet a friend. It can be very simple to color a picture of Jesus. You'd be surprised. The goal is not for you to achieve some major milestone, but these small milestones are major milestones in an atypical child's life. And they make a huge, huge impact on the family long term. So don't limit yourself by anything. And then create just an additional space for any notes about the child that just, that you may have not asked. Okay, I highly recommend personally calling the family on Monday after service and asking how it went, asking if there is anything additional they could do to best serve their child and encouraging them to come back. Feedback can only happen through communication. And you may have a very large church, a very small church, maybe you work multiple jobs, but one of the things that you can do is just give yourself permission to say, hey, today I'm going to block off 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and I'm going to call these particular parents and just say, how did it go? Is there something we could have done better? Is there something that was successful? So we know in the future, like, this is a good thing. The more consistent the child is in the environment, the easier transitions will be. So try, if something was successful, don't try to add or subtract something from that environment. Try to keep that as consistent as possible. They will be more familiar in the future, but have consistent positive attitudes. So they'll become more patient, they'll be more engaged because they feel safer in the environment. So again, just keeping to that consistency. As I was trying to think of a verse that could really encompass all that goes into being there for atypical families. I'm reminded of John chapter 9, verses 1 through 3. As he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, It was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. It's so important that we don't get wrapped up in the idea of fixing or attempting to narrate an idea that the child needs fixing, um, because you don't understand the purpose of that child. We don't understand the purpose for that family going through that season or this particular environment in which they're in. And so to really watch the language of your volunteers, watch the language of those integrating with people that are hurting just in general. I've heard some pretty dumb things be said to people, including like, if you only had enough faith, your child would be healed. It's a very sick thing to say to a family, because to me, you have no idea what their experience has been. And then we are always hoping for blessed miracles, and we're always looking for ways for God to reveal himself in a miraculous way. We also know that he can use afflictions that he gave the disciples at times in ways as well to communicate. So don't assume someone's story. If you personally are working with the church or have had an experience with the church and it's been positive or negative, we want to hear that story. You can always go to our app. Made to Walk is our free app, and you can click on share your story, and we want to hear about things that work in your environment or don't work in your environment so that we can share that with others as well. I hope this was helpful, and I hope that you have a blessed rest of your week.